Good morning. I see folks are joining the webinar. Nice to see you all. Welcome. We'll get started in just a few seconds. We'll wait for folks to join, get added to the webinar. Thank you all for being here this morning. Happy to have you. All right, well, I'm going to jump in because we have so much to talk about today. The FAFSA CADAA. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Completing the FAFSA CADAA for Youth with Experience in Foster Care or Homelessness. We are John Burton Advocates for Youth, and I'm Megan Maddock. I'm a project manager with JBay, and we are a nonprofit organization that seeks to advocate for young people in California who have been in foster care or homelessness by uplifting needs around education, housing, and economic mobility. And we do this by advocating for better laws, training our communities to strengthen local practices like we're doing today, and by conducting research to inform policy solutions. So thank you all for being part of our community today as we're talking about education needs for our foster and homeless youth. Just a bit of housekeeping this morning. So our webinar is going to be recorded and will be posted online later this week, likely on Friday. So if you can't stay for the whole webinar, don't worry. You'll have the opportunity to see it later. Attendees may turn on or disable closed captioning. You can see that at the bottom of your screen. We are also joined today by two ASL interpreters, so thank you both for being here today. And then importantly for questions, so chat is disabled or global chat is disabled in this webinar. So please submit any questions that you might have in the Q&A section. I see some folks have raised their hand as well. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in that Q&A section. We have some incredible subject matter experts who I'll introduce on the next slide, who will be answering your questions throughout the webinar. And speaking of experts, again, I'll introduce myself again. I'm Megan Maddock. I'm a project manager at JBay, and I'll ask my co-presenter, Jessica, to introduce herself as well.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for being here. My name is Jessica Petroff. I'm our Director of Education here at JBay.
Great. And the unseen but incredibly important experts we have answering your questions. We have Mark Kantrowitz, who is truly an expert on many things financial aid and is a resource for us at JBay. Debbie Rauscher, who's our interim executive director, is going to also be answering questions. And last but not least, Jillian Sitjar from Schoolhouse Connection and our amazing partners there will also be answering your Q&A. So thanks to them, and thank you all for your questions. We're looking forward to seeing them come in. So for today, like I mentioned up top, we've got a full agenda. We will be talking about why financial aid matters and why the process of completing the FAFSA and CADAA is so important for our young people, especially for our students experiencing foster care or homelessness. I know we're all anxious to learn what's new with the FAFSA this year, so we'll be talking a little bit about updates, and then we'll go into how to apply for financial aid. So we'll be talking about the key steps to completing the FAFSA CADAA for our foster and homeless youth, including key steps to take before even starting that application and after you complete the application. And we'll be doing a lot of information. We'll be throwing a lot of information at you today, but don't worry, we will have helpful resources for you all to take away so that you can always reference our materials as you're working with students. And just a couple reminders about our webinar today. So we are focusing on independent single students today. So we will be talking about what that means, independent or dependent students, but students who are considered dependent need to provide information about parents, and we won't be covering that in this webinar. So we'll only be focused on our students who are independent and don't have to provide parental information. Married students will need to provide spousal income information. We are also not covering that in this webinar. As I mentioned in our agenda, we'll be covering kind of highlights only, so it doesn't go through the FAFSA CADAA quite step by step, although it does cover the important steps. But like I mentioned, at the end, we'll share other resources that we are making available that provide that more comprehensive overview of all the steps, as well as other general FAFSA CADAA completion resources. And then finally, as you all know, never a dull moment in the FAFSA land. The application was just released, but things may change. So this is information that we have of today, and if any updates come out, please stay connected to JBay, and we will always share those updates as they come in. So I'll turn it over to Jessica, who will kick us off and talk about why financial aid is so important.
Thanks, Megan, and thank you everyone for taking time out of your day this morning to join us to learn about how to support your students in filling out their financial aid applications, because this work can really make a big difference in the lives of our students. And we know that for our youth in the foster care system and our youth experiencing homelessness, they often face a lot of additional significant barriers while pursuing post-secondary education. So your support is really critical in helping them reach those educational goals. I'm sure as many of you know, they often are lacking parental or familial support, often experiencing a lack of stable housing along the way, which can impact them educationally. And of course, the trauma many of them have experienced both through the foster care experience and through homelessness as well. And through this journey, many of them don't get the academic preparation and the supports that they need to thrive academically as well. And as we talk about some of the financial aid programs and resources that are out there, a lot of times these programs might have a lot of, cumbersome application processes or additional documentation that they have to fill out, which can, be a burden on students and be another barrier. And so your support in helping them navigate this process is really critical along the way. And I'll say lastly, and this isn't unique to our youth in foster care or youth experiencing homelessness, but generally these days we're seeing a lot of young people in society in the US are having more increased skepticism about the value of higher education. And the truth is that it's still just as relevant as before. We're still seeing that nationally over 70% of all jobs require some form of post-secondary education. So accessing higher education is a really essential thing for our students to be able to ultimately have economic mobility and thrive. And assisting them in getting financial aid is a critical step in helping them reach those higher educational goals. What we see from the research and the data is that financial aid really does make a difference. And when high school seniors in general, when they complete the FAFSA, they're 84% more likely to actually enroll in higher education. So just the act of filling out the application helps to plant the seed and set them up for success towards higher education. And the more money they receive, the more likely they are to transfer and graduate. We see for foster youth who received the Chafee grant, which we'll talk more about later, but those students who got that additional $5,000 were 2.5 times more likely to actually complete their degree. So really big impacts we see with that type of financial aid. And then in general, the more financial aid, if they received, $7,500, about 50% of them transferred or graduated, compared to students who only got maybe $1,000 or $2,500, only 17% transferred or graduated. So we want to make sure they can get all that financial aid into their pockets to succeed. And the good news is there's a lot of financial aid out there for our students to access. What I have up on the screen is just a snapshot of a sample financial aid package for a full-time student who doesn't have children that might be attending a community college. And you can see that this financial aid really starts to add up when you look at available federal and state aid. Now, I want to acknowledge, I recognize that youth in foster care are eligible for more financial aid than our students experiencing homelessness, but the amount of aid that our homeless students can receive, is substantial as well. Now, we're not going to go into all the different types of financial aid that are out there for students, but as I'll share at the end of our webinar, we do have a financial aid guide that goes in detail about all the different financial aid programs, eligibility, deadlines, how to apply. So definitely check out that resource because we want to make sure that these students know about this financial aid, know how it adds up, and know how to fill out those applications to get that money.
Jessica, I'm sorry to jump in. I no longer see the slideshow, so I just want to make sure we're still sharing.
Oh, it says it's sharing on my end. Is it black?
I see it fine, and I
Okay.
see people are saying in the chat they see it, so I think it's
Okay.
fine.
Oh,
Okay.
okay,
Thanks. Sorry about that.
great. That's okay. Thanks for checking in. Um, so as I was also going to share too, what we also see that makes a difference in addition to that financial aid is all of you. So filling out the applications for financial aid ends up creating a great opportunity for you to have a broader discussion with your youth about their future, about their plans, about the benefits of post-secondary education, and about their potential that they are college material. And what we've seen from the research is that when foster youth reported receiving a lot of encouragement to continue their education beyond high school, just that conversation alone meant that they had a greater likelihood of not just going to college, but actually completing college. So the messages that you're sending to your students make a difference as well through this process. And as Megan shared, as we go through the application, we're going to cover, all the important elements about how to fill out these applications, how to do that correctly. But the most effective tool in your toolbox as you're thinking about strategies to help our youth fill out these applications comes down to personal one-on-one assistance. So as you're thinking about, okay, what strategies can I do to support our students? Think about how you can make sure that all of your students are connected to one-on-one support, because that's what we see makes the difference, and that's what we see works to help our students in navigating these applications and getting the money in their bank accounts. So we're going to cover a lot of this different elements of the applications, but just wanted to flag as kind of a broader overview, a few new things to keep in mind as we go into the application. Not sure if you saw, but just as of the 18th, the FAFSA and the California DREAM Act application are now open. So good news, those are now open. Students can start filling out those applications. They were in kind of beta testing before. The Department of Education is going to continue to monitor the FAFSA form, but we've heard good news so far about the new application. So you can start working with your students as soon as possible. The other update we wanted to share, and as Megan shared before, our webinar today is really just focused on supporting independent students in completing the FAFSA and the California DREAM Act application. So we're not going to be covering the steps for dependent students and their parents who would typically contribute to the FAFSA as well. However, we do know that many of you are also working with other student groups who are dependents and do have to work with their parents to fill out the applications. So we did want to share one update is that if you are working with a student who has a parent that does not have a social security number, they're undocumented, the FAFSA process, the identity verification process for those contributors who don't have a social security number, will be waived just like it was last year. So once they create an FSA ID, which is essentially their username and password to access the application, they'll have immediate access to the FAFSA. We know, though, that for many mixed status families right now, particularly with the new incoming Trump administration, there's a lot of concerns about families in identifying their undocumented status to the federal government. So we did also want to share that given this, California has their California DREAM Act application, also referred to as the CADAA, and it will be open again this year for mixed status families as well if they feel more comfortable filling out that state application instead of the FAFSA. However, if the family does choose this route, the student will only be eligible for state financial aid and not federal financial aid like the Pell Grant. So families will need to weigh the pros and cons of these options to determine what is best for them. So those were just a couple quick high-level updates about what's new with the FAFSA, and now I will turn it over to Megan to actually walk through these applications and all the key steps along the way.
Yes, let's get ready to go through the FAFSA CADA.
Time for the fun.
Yes. So the first step is just to figure out which application to complete. And we have two options. You've already heard them today, the FAFSA and the CADA. So the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. This form is for U.S. citizens, permanent residents, such as green card holders, or other eligible non-citizens. And although this application, has the word federal in the name, this is used to apply for both federal and state financial aid. The application is available online and it's mobile friendly, which is it's just good for our students, and is available in English and Spanish. So those who don't qualify to submit a FAFSA because of immigration status may be eligible to complete the other application, which is the California Dream Act application, or the CADA. And that is available to our undocumented students under Assembly Bill 540. So if students meet certain eligibility criteria, such as attending California schools for a minimum period of time, um, the CADA also applies to certain categories of visa holders who could not submit a FAFSA, such as those with temporary protected status or a U visa. There's lots of more information about that eligibility criteria on the CADA website. And so if you are working with a student who is undocumented or maybe in one of those categories, I highly recommend going over to the CSAC website and reading more about the eligibility there. The CADA is also an online application, but the online application is only available in English. So you may be able to use your browser's translations to read the application in a different language, although there is a paper version of the application that is available in Spanish. So as Jessica mentioned kind of in the previous section, the completing the CADA only allows students to be eligible for state financial aid, not federal aid, but it also qualifies students as California residents for in-state tuition. So important for our students to have access to that tuition. So for those of you who are working with students in foster care who are undocumented, they may be in that process where they have a pending application for residency through SIGIS, the Special Immigration Juvenile Status Program. So if they're in that process, and they've received their permanent resident status, they would be eligible for the federal financial aid and can complete the FAFSA. If they're still in the process, if it's still pending, if they haven't actually received that permanent resident status, we'd want them to complete the CADA. And again, as Jessica mentioned, there are some concerns, rightfully so, about young people and students wanting to disclose their status as undocumented on an application. And just want to again reassure students and adult supporters that these applications are confidential and the information that is submitted through CADA is not shared with the federal government. And our partners at the California Student Aid Commission recently, just yesterday, actually reaffirmed their commitment to undocumented student data privacy. And we've linked that notice there on the slide, and you'll be able to read it in more detail when we send the slides out after this presentation. So financial aid financial aid is determined in several ways. So first of all, we have the cost of attendance, and this is the total amount it costs to attend college. That includes tuition. It also includes all those other things that a student needs to have when they attend college. So housing, meals, books, supplies, transportation, and each college determines this amount for their college. Next, the FAFSA and CADAA are asking the student a series of questions to determine a student aid index or SAI. If you have filled out the FAFSA in the past with other students, you remember this being the expected family contribution. It's now the SAI student aid index. And this is based on a student's income, assets, household size. And the lower the number is, the more aid the student is eligible for. And new to the FAFSA as of last year, this SAI can actually go into the negative now, as low as negative 1,500. So we take this information, we take the cost of of attendance for a particular college, and we take the SAI, and the SAI is subtracted from the cost of attendance to determine a student's eligibility for need-based aid, such as Cal Grant or Pell Grant. And a reminder for our folks working with foster youth students, the Chafee grant, which is a really important and key grant for foster youth that we'll talk a little bit more about later, is actually excluded from the calculation of eligibility for unmet need. This started last year and means that students receiving the Chafee grant can receive those funds above and beyond the cost of attendance, unlike other forms of financial aid, which is great news for our foster youth who often need that additional aid. Keeping in mind our deadlines, so the priority application period is usually October 1st to March 2nd before the start of the school year you plan to attend college. Jessica mentioned up top that this year things were delayed a little bit, but the FAFSA was released earlier than we anticipated, which is great news. This year, the priority deadline is March 3rd. March 2nd falls on a weekend, so you have that day. Students can still submit after this deadline, although you may get less money, and CSU and UC students must submit by this deadline, this March 3rd deadline, to receive the Cal Grant and middle class scholarship. So definitely put this date on your calendar. Students planning on attending a community college have until September 2nd to apply, but again, we still encourage students to apply as soon as possible, so we want to qualify them for the maximum aid. And while these deadlines are here, that we know that schools like private schools and out-of-state colleges may have different deadlines. So if your students are looking to go out of state, they're looking at a private school, just double check with the campus to make sure that you're submitting the application by their deadline. And I know deadlines are important and definitely want to encourage folks to get it in before that March 3rd deadline. And one thing to think about, you may still have students who are thinking about where they want to go to college or they don't know where they want to go to college. They can still complete their application before they know where to go. And it may actually help them make that decision because they'll be able to see how much financial aid they're eligible for. So lastly, last year with the FAFSA, there were some changes to the priority deadline for four-year universities. We haven't necessarily heard anything yet this year, but it is important to note that these priority deadlines can change. So definitely keep in touch with us at JBay and keep your bookmarked on the CSAC website so you can see if there's any updates on the deadlines. All right, so let's talk a little bit about preparing for the FAFSA CADAA. So we figured out what application we're going to submit. We've got the deadlines on our calendars, and now we want to start with creating an FSA ID. So before filling out the FAFSA, students must create a federal student aid ID or an FSA ID. This is a username and password for the FAFSA. And this only applies to the FAFSA. There's a different account creation for the CADAA, which I'll talk about in the next couple slides. So this is a change from last year. Excuse me, this was a change that was created last year where you will need to create the FSA ID in advance of doing the FAFSA, as it can take a few days to process. So you must kind of complete the application to create your FSA ID, and there's an approval process that takes up to a few days. So to create an FSA ID, you can go to that studentaid.gov website that is on the screen and follow the directions to create a new account. So like I said, you do want to work with students at least a few days in advance to create this FSA ID so that when you're ready to sit down and do the FAFSA, you have the FSA ID in hand. And for the FAFSA, there is a two-factor authentication process for both the FSA ID and the FAFSA. So when you're logging in to create once you've created your FSA ID, you're logging into the FAFSA, you will have to confirm your account by entering a code that's either sent to your phone, your email, or an authenticator app. So in creating the FSA ID, students will be asked for some information. First, they'll be asked to provide an email address. So as always with financial aid and college applications, we recommend using an email address that doesn't expire. So many students have high school email addresses, and we recommend you use something like a Yahoo or a Gmail account that the student can check regularly beyond when those high school emails expire. We also recommend that you provide a phone number, a cell phone number. It's not required for the FSA ID, but it is helpful in case, like we all do, get locked out of your account and you need to reset your password. It's easy to do that with your cell phone number. Students will also be asked to provide their social security number, and we should take care to enter their legal name when creating the FSA ID exactly how it appears on their social security card. So this may be a barrier for some students. Some students, especially our students in foster care experiencing homelessness, they may not know their social security number or may not have their card. So it's important, if that's the case, that you help advocate for your student to get in touch with their social worker or their independent living program representative so that they can get a copy of that card. For our students experiencing homelessness, working with their high school counselor to get a replacement card would be ideal, so that they have this card not just for the FSCID and the FAFSA, but for other needs as well. And if a student doesn't have a social security number, this might be an indication that they should apply for the CADAA. So definitely something to explore for those students. Students will also be asked to provide a permanent address. For our students experiencing homelessness, you'll want to identify a place they can receive mail. So this can be, for example, a friend, a relative, maybe a social service agency that has given them permission to do so. It's important that they have a place where they can access, important documents that are being mailed to them. And finally, this is a great time to help students create a system to safely store their username and passwords. So the post-it notes stuck on your computer screen are probably this is time for a better process for our students, because there'll be a lot of different username and passwords as they're completing college applications and scholarship applications and all of those other applications. Right, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So for our CADAA, students will need to create an account on the CADAA website. And although it's not required for the account creation, we do recommend that students provide their statewide student identifier number, their SSID, or their ITIN number. The SSID, that statewide student identifier number, is a unique number that's linked to a given individual student within the California public educational system. Students can find this number on their high school transcripts, or they can ask their high school counselor for help looking that number up. A student who is undocumented would obtain an ITIN to file a federal income tax return. So the ITIN is optional, SSCID are optional, and many students may not have an ITIN if they didn't file taxes or didn't make enough money to be required to file taxes. And just like the FAFSA, the CADA does require that two-factor authentication using an email address. So again, you'll get that. You log in, you'll get a code sent to your email address. So another reminder to use a email address that a student can check regularly that they have access to beyond high school. And finally, students can opt in to receive text messages from the California Student Aid Commission that sends them reminders, text message reminders about financial aid deadlines and updates. And so this is a great thing for them to do if they're comfortable to make sure that they have those reminders as they're completing their applications. So again, what students need to apply, and these are things that you can help your student with before sitting down to complete the FAFSA or CADA. So we talked about the login needs for the FAFSA or the CADA. So the FSA ID will need or the SSID or ITIN number for the CADA. Students will also need a list of up to at least one and up to 20 colleges that they're interested in attending and that would receive their FAFSA CADA information. They'll also need information about their current assets, such as the amounts that are in their cash saving, such as cash, any amounts that are in their savings and checkings account. There's a limited scenario in which a student would need a copy of their tax return, and we will talk about that when we get to the financial section of the FAFSA. And then importantly, for our students, the FAFSA and CADA is an application process, but we want to be mindful of the students that we're working with. And, there's several parts of the FAFSA or CADA that could be potentially feel sensitive or personal to our students in foster care experiencing homelessness. Some of the challenge questions that are asked when creating the FSAID and CADA might relate to a family or their identity and might be a potential, again, personal trigger for that student. In addition, there are questions that relate to gender identity, fears for student safety, and family history within the FAFSA and CADA, which again might feel sensitive or personal or challenging for a particular student to discuss. So we want to make sure that, in this space when we're helping students complete this application, that we're creating a safe, welcoming environment that they can feel confident in submitting their applications and more comfortable completing it in the future as well. All right, so we're going to dive into the form itself now. So, um, in terms of what we're going to be going over today, like I mentioned up top, we're not going to be quite going over every single section of the FAFSA. So what you see highlighted in orange are the particular sections of the FAFSA CADA that we'll be talking about today. If you are interested in really going through step by step, we will be releasing a visual guide that does have the screenshots, the step-by-step screenshots of the FAFSA and CADA very soon. Or you still have access to review the FAFSA prototype on the Student Aid website, which is a great step-by-step tool as well. So diving right into the FAFSA. The FAFSA application is looking at a student's income information for the prior year. So in this school year, the 25-26 year, this would be tax information from 2023. And good news is that the FAFSA is automatically pulling that tax data in using the federal tax information tool. So this is something that was launched last year, and you may already be familiar with it, but students, when they're completing the FAFSA, must approve and provide consent to import data from from the federal tax information in order to be eligible for federal student aid. So you can see that approval up there on the screen. This is a step in the FAFSA that they'll have to complete, and they must provide this approval even if they did not file a tax return. And I think good news for us and for many of our students is that students who did not file a tax return will no longer be required to provide a separate verification of non-filing letter from the IRS. So this tool is regardless if they've filed taxes or not. Again, I mentioned that, you may want to have a copy of the student's tax return on hand, and especially if they've received scholarships during the requested tax year. So again, it's 2023 as we're moving into the 25-26 school year. And we'll talk about that again a little bit later when we dive into more of the financial questions. We also know that students' financial circumstances can change, and so if that has occurred since 2023 when they file taxes, they should reach out to the financial aid office at the college they plan to attend and request an adjustment to that income because it may make a difference in terms of their eligibility for financial aid. And just a reminder that for this process about kind of automatically importing data, this consent, this applies to the FAFSA and not the CADAA. So for the CADAA, for students completing the CADAA, you will have to enter your tax information manually, so you will want a copy of that tax return on hand. Students will also be asked what their college or career school plans are. So first they'll be asked what their college grade level will be when they begin the 25-26 school year. So all first-time students should select, their first year freshmen. Even students who took dual enrollment courses in high school should still select that first year freshman box. And as a reminder for returning students, this isn't necessarily based on the number of years that a student has attended college, but on units completed towards that degree or certificate. So for example, a full-time student might attain second year grade level after 1 year of study because they've achieved that number of credits, while a half-time student might take longer to reach that level. So we're going to move into the critical screens for our foster and our homeless students. So the student personal circumstances is a set of questions to determine if a student is independent. An independent student does not need to provide information from their parents, including financial information. So this allows them to be eligible for more financial aid. All students are asked this set of questions, and they may select all of the circumstances that might apply to that individual student. And this helps determine independence. It also helps identify students for other services and programs that are available. So first we'll talk about our foster youth. So this is kind of a magnified version of that longer list that we saw on the last slide and highlights specifically the questions related to foster youth. So there are three potential statements that could apply to a foster youth student that you're working with. At any time since the student turned 13, they were a ward of the court. At any time since the student turned 13, they were in foster care. Or the student is or was in a legal guardianship with someone other than their parent or step-parent as determined by a court in their state of residence. So students may select all that apply in this situation again. And I did want to highlight the first two, that ward of a court and foster care. So we don't have any guidance regarding the difference between being in foster care and being a ward of the court. So students who are in foster care can check either or both. To qualify, a student must have been declared a dependent by the court and lived in an out-of-home placement at any point on or after their 13th birthday. So they can check that box if they were in foster care, after the age of 13 for as little as a single day. So it's important to note too for that ward of the court piece. Sometimes that can be confusing for those of you who are working with youth in the juvenile justice system. So if a foster youth who is under the jurisdiction of the probation system, so they're dually involved, they've got an open foster care case and an open juvenile justice case, they can select that box. However, if someone is just under the jurisdiction of juvenile justice, just under the jurisdiction of probation, or someone who is incarcerated, they are not considered a ward of the court for FAFSA purposes. So important to keep that distinction in mind. And then as a reminder, to qualify under the legal guardianship criteria, the students must have had a guardianship in place currently or when they turned 18. And the guardianship applies to both kinship or relative guardians and non-related legal guardianships as well. So if a student indicates they are a foster youth, their status will be verified. And this is done through an automatic data match with the California Department of Social Services. And once this verification occurs, the foster youth status does not need to be redetermined each year, which is great news for our students. However, we know with data matches, sometimes it's not perfect. Small changes in spellings or other errors can mean that that match with CDSS doesn't happen. So in the next slide, we'll talk about what to do if a foster youth needs to obtain kind of a manual verification. So the good news is there is a lot more folks on a list who can provide that verification to your financial aid administrator of the college that the student will be attending. So financial aid administrators can accept any number of these or any one of these verifications. So a court order or an official state documentation that indicates the student was in foster care. If they've been determined as eligible for a Chafee grant, or the financial aid administrator can also accept a phone call or a written statement from any one of these folks listed on the slide. So a state, county, or tribal agency kind of administering a program under Title B or E of the Social Security Act, a state Medicaid agency, a foster care placing agency or a foster care facility or placement, the student's attorney or their court-appointed special advocate, their CASA, or a financial aid administrator who maybe who documented the student's circumstance in the same or prior award year. So that there's many ways a student can receive this verification, and it's definitely something as an adult supporter you can help your students access. And to access, that kind of first bullet point on the last slide, that official state documentation, you may also hear it as a dependency letter or a foster youth verification letter. If they are currently in foster care, they can get this verification letter from their social worker or their independent living program kind of coordinator. So if you're working with a student who's currently in care, you want to help them get in touch with those folks to be able to get this letter. If they're no longer in care, they can contact the Office of the California Foster Care Ombudsperson and make a request to receive a copy of that verification letter. So even if a student's data match goes smoothly and they aren't asked to provide manual verification, it's still a great idea to help your young person, your student, get their hands on this letter before they graduate. It's good to have it if they don't already have it, and they may need it for other services and supports like scholarship applications. So moving on to our unaccompanied homeless student, all students will be asked about their experiencing homelessness or self-supporting or at risk of being homelessness. And we'll talk a little bit more about what it means to be unaccompanied as shown on the question, and what it means to be self-supporting and at risk of being homelessness. So unaccompanied, a student who is unaccompanied is not in the physical custody of a parent or a guardian. And homeless definition for the FAFSA means lacking fixed, regular, and adequate housing. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like on the next slide. So to be determined to be independent on the FAFSA, students will need to be both unaccompanied and homeless, or unaccompanied and self-supporting at risk of being homeless. So self-supporting situations might be a case where a student is paying for their own living expenses. So they're paying their own living expenses, they're paying their rent. At risk of being homeless means that a student is self-supporting and their housing, their stable housing maybe cease to be fixed, regular, or adequate very soon. So, for example, you have a student who, again, is responsible for their lease, they're paying their rent, but they're in the process of being evicted and they don't have their next housing situation lined up. So, in that case, they would be self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So lacking that fixed, regular, and adequate housing includes students who are in a variety of different situations. So this could be students who are staying with other people temporarily, such as they're couch surfing. They might be living in motels, hotels, or camping grounds, or living in an emergency shelter. They may also be living in their car or sleeping outside or someplace not normally meant for a human to be sleeping or for a human to be living. The next question, so if a student says yes to that question about experiencing homelessness, they will be asked if they have verification from any of the listed entities, which includes your high school homeless liaisons, as well as programs serving students experiencing homelessness. If you are working with a student who has already indicated foster youth status, so let's say you're completing the FAFSA with your student, they are a foster youth student and they are currently unaccompanied and experiencing homelessness, they will not be asked this question about who is determining the student was homeless or risk of homelessness. So you may not see that slide if both of those questions are answered. So as a reminder, college financial aid administrators must accept documentation, like the foster youth documentation, from these entities unless there is documented conflicting information about the student's situation. And like our foster youth status, this status does not need to be redetermined every year. That would be the case unless a student informs their college that their circumstances have changed, or again, the institution has conflicting information about the student situation. Whenever possible, and this is a great tip for our adult supporters on the call, we want to help our students get the determination from one of these sources now while they're still in high school or when they have your support, rather than relying on the college financial aid administrator to make this determination. And this is something that you all, as you're working with your students, can help the students do now so they're fully prepared with their determination when they complete the FAFSA. And as a reminder, again, for our financial aid administrators, this determination must be made as quickly as possible and without regard to the reasons why a student is unaccompanied or homeless. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next couple of slides. So we can go to the next one, please. And a reminder, before we jump to what happens if a student is not able to get one of those determinations, they have to select none of these apply. I just wanted to remind, our McKinney-Vento liaisons in the audience that under the FAFSA Simplification Act, you can now designate other people to provide these homelessness determinations. So counselors, social workers, other folks at your school, and this can be a huge help to you as you are working with many students. And I want to shout out our partners at Schoolhouse Connection who have created sample determination letters, specifically with a section to designate others and a FAFSA referral form for our liaisons as well. And we've listed this resource, this website in the resources section at the end of the slide. So let's go back to that list of determinations. So if a student selects none of these apply, so they are unable to have a determination from any of those folks on the list, students can still continue to complete the FAFSA as an independent student, but they must contact their financial aid office to complete that determination process. And in this case, they would reach out to the financial aid office, financial aid office at the college they're intending to go to, and that financial aid administrator would make a determination for the youth. And that is typically based off a written statement or a documented interview with your student. And as I mentioned earlier, this determination must be made based on the legal definitions of homelessness and unaccompanied that we talked about earlier, and it's not a matter of professional judgment. So financial aid administrators are making this, again, making this determination independent from the reasons that a student is unaccompanied or homeless. So just an important thing to keep in mind when working with students. The FAFSA Simplification Act also permits students to complete the FAFSA as a provisional independent student. So this is a situation where a student may believe they qualify for independent status due to unusual circumstances. So this could be, a situation where they've left their home due to an abusive or threatened environment. They are a victim of human trafficking, or their family, their parents are incarcerated. So in this case, a student answering yes to this question would be considered provisionally independent. And in this case, again, they would have to contact their financial aid administrator at their college to make that final determination of whether a student would be considered independent. And in this case, financial aid administrators have more flexibility when evaluating these unusual circumstances. And so again, working with your student to be able to connect with their financial aid administrator and provide any information or documentation that that financial aid administrator might need to determine that independence. All right, so we've gone through a really key components of the FAFSA and CADAA, and we're now moving on to other sections of the CADAA. The FAFSA and the CADAA. So the students will also be asked about their demographics. Again, they will be asked about their citizenship status. So this is, again, an important reminder if you're working with our students who are not U.S. citizens, they should complete the CADAA, or are not eligible non-citizens, they should complete the CADAA. A few tips for our demographic sections. Students may select prefer not to answer about some of these questions around gender, race, or ethnicity. There's also a question about parental education status, and they can select that they don't know. And these answers don't impact their eligibility for aid. So if students don't necessarily have to disclose their gender, race, or ethnicity when completing the FAFSA or CADAA, those questions are not shared with colleges or federal agencies anyway. They are for research purposes only. And again, another reminder, we talked about this at the top of the presentation, but these set of questions may feel personal or sensitive to some students, and in some cases, a student may have not disclosed their gender identity to others or an adult supporter. And so again, you want to create a safe, welcoming space for your students so that they feel comfortable in responding to these questions in the way that feels most comfortable to them. If a student is an eligible non-citizen, they'll be asked to enter their alien registration number. And they also will be asked about their current their high school of attendance. So if they completed high school, you'll have to use a search function to find their high school to make sure that it's entered correctly with the correct city and name of the high school. And when asked about high school completion status, just a reminder that students who are homeschooled or who may have received a high school equivalency certificate like the HiSET or the GED, they are still eligible for financial aid. So once a student completes the demographic section, there is a set of financial questions, and this is much reduced from previous years of the FAFSA. This was a big change for last year. And one of the questions is around if a student has received any federal benefits. So the form kind of shows different options for benefits, and it doesn't impact their eligibility for aid. However, we do encourage students to disclose the information, disclose which programs that they might be receiving, because this may make students exempt from reporting current assets. So it might make some of the other financial questions a little bit easier for them to answer. But one thing to keep in mind that might be confusing for students and how as an adult supporter you can support your students is that the names of these federal programs are the federal names and are different than what we say in California or what they're called in California. So for example, Medicaid is the federal program in California, it's Medi-Cal. SNAP is the federal name for our CalFresh, and TANF is the federal name for CalWORKs. So important to help students identify the benefits that they're receiving. And so we talked at the very first kind of point of the FAFSA about that federal tax information process and how you do need to approve the federal tax information import into the FAFSA. But there are still questions about types of income and related to taxes. Most of them are extremely unlikely for to be relevant to a student, but one of them asks about college grants, scholarships, or AmeriCorps benefits that were reported as income to the IRS. So if a student had any of these sources of income in 2023 and included them on their 2023 tax return, it's important that they be reported on this FAFSA, even though the form shows this as optional. And it's important to enter this information because this amount, the amount reported, will be deducted from the student's total income and they could be eligible for more aid. Again, there'll be some more questions around student assets. So if it is not listed on the slide, it does not need to be reported. So these are the questions around assets that a student will be asked. Students will be asked about the current total, again, of cash that they have and the total amounts in their savings and checking accounts. And it's important to remember that financial aid that's been received, such as grants or scholarships, does not need to be reported. So for example, if this is a returning student and they've already received their financial aid disbursement for the spring and they have, $10,000 sitting in their bank account, that number should not be included in that asset total. Students are also asked about current net worth of investments, real estate, business, investment forms, but it's important to note that it does not include the value of a car or a computer. We're getting there. We're almost there. And finally, students will be asked to select the colleges where they want their financial aid information to be sent. So it, students can select up to 20 colleges, which again, this was a change for last year that students were now able to have 20 colleges to include on their application. And if they change their mind, after the application is processed, they can always update their application by removing colleges and adding colleges, and they can repeat this process as many times as they want or that they feel is necessary. The original colleges that that you include on the FAFSA will still receive the information. And a reminder for this too, that each UC and CSU may be listed separately. So a student is not able to, for example, apply to all the UCs or all the CSUs at once. And an important reminder about the FAFSA and a change that was carries over from last year is that students are no longer asked about their housing plans. However, their housing plan does impact the calculation for that cost of attendance and how much aid a student is eligible for. So colleges must determine the housing status from their own records, such as which student paid a housing deposit, and many colleges are providing an initial financial aid award offer based on the assumption of living on campus, with a caveat that the aid may change if the student doesn't live on campus. But just a reminder for students that if they're completing the application, then the college application, their admissions application, to answer questions around housing needs so that their financial aid is reflective of their actual housing needs once they get to college. All right, well, we have made it to the end. And a student will be asked to sign their FAFSA, and then once submitted, they will receive this confirmation page. The confirmation page will have their student aid index, their estimated student aid index displayed. So as a reminder, when we talked about SAI, this is used to determine eligibility for student aid, and that number is not the amount of aid the student will actually be receiving. The student will also receive a FAFSA submission summary that summarizes the information that you reported or that they reported on their FAFSA form. So it includes their estimated eligibility for a federal Pell Grant and student loans. It includes your SAI and whether the student has been selected for verification. You can also review this. You can also review the submission summary to make sure that the student hasn't made any errors in the FAFSA or if they need to make a correction later after they've already submitted their FAFSA. And before we talk about kind of what happens after we've completed our application, one final note for the CADAA. So the AB 540 affidavit is now embedded in the CADAA application. The AB 540 exempts certain students from paying non-resident tuition, which is higher than resident tuition, and allows them to apply for and receive certain state aid at certain California and public and private colleges. So with this change, students no longer have to file a separate AB 540 affidavit. It's contained in the CADAA. However, each college is responsible for verifying eligibility and may request transcripts or other documentation from the student to confirm. We do have one exception to that in that the UCs currently are not accepting the embedded AB 450 450 affidavit that's in the CADAA, so they may require an additional form. So if your student is attending a UC, they may need to be provide a separate form for this affidavit. And when the student is completing the CADAA, they will be asked to enter each school or college they've attended, including the dates they've attended, the type of credit, high school or college, and the unit hours they received per school. That is to determine their eligibility again for that non-resident tuition. All right, congratulations. We made it through the many steps in the FAFSA, and I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, who will talk about what to do now after you've completed the FAFSA CADAA.
Thanks so much, Megan. So one of the critical steps that we recommend for our students with foster care history is to apply for the Chafee Grant. And the Chafee Grant is for current or former foster youth who were a dependent or ward of the court for at least one day between the ages of 16 to 18. And if they fill out this application, they can get up to $5,000 in additional financial aid for up to 5 years, whether or not consecutive. So they can, go to school, take a break, come back, and they can access this financial aid up until the age of 26. The great thing is this can be used at public schools, private colleges, career and technical schools, and it can be used both in California or for students who are planning to attend college out of state. The student does need to be enrolled, though, at least half time, which is 6 units. And to access this financial aid, they do have to fill out a separate application. And a lot of students aren't aware that it is a separate application. We've got the link here on the slide, but they only have to fill out this additional application one time, and then that's it. They won't have to reapply after that first year. And this is, again, in addition to them filling out the FAFSA or the California DREAM Act application. There's not a hard deadline for applying for this, but we encourage them to apply as soon as possible. There is limited funding for this grant, so funding can run out. And depending on availability of funding, then students would be placed on a wait list. Once they're on a wait list, again, they won't have to reapply. They'll just be in the queue for the next year if they attend college the following year as well. The application is very straightforward. It shouldn't take them very long, maybe about 10 minutes. But one question we did want to flag for you is there is a question that asks about their planned school of attendance, but they can only pick one college to enter. And for many students at the time they're filling out this application, they may not yet know where they want to go. So we encourage them, fill it out to the best of their ability, enter a college, and then when they log into their WebGrants account, which I'll mention soon on the next slide, that is where they'll go in and update it to make sure that the correct school is listed and that will be listed to receive the funding for the Chafee grant. If their school isn't listed, this is more likely in the case if they're planning on attending a college out of state. There'll be instructions and you'll contact CSAC and the student will be able to work with CSAC to get that college enrolled in their system so they can receive the aid at that institution. So WebGrants, as I mentioned, now this is an account that we want all of our students to create, not just our youth in foster care. And this is a website used to manage state financial aid here in California. So this is the Chafee grant, the Cal grant, the middle class scholarship, a lot of these large financial aid programs. This is where a student will log in to be able to see the status of their award and manage that aid. They'll want to do this after their FAFSA or CADAA has been processed. So with the FAFSA, it can take 1 to 2 weeks before it's successfully processed. So once it's processed, they'll be able to go in and create their WebGrants account. And we also have on the slide, there's contact information for the California Student Aid Commission if the students, have any issues in setting up that account. Once the student is in their WebGrants account, here are a few things that we encourage them to do once they're in there. First they'll be able to check the award status again for any state financial aid that they might be eligible for. It'll say, green, they're awarded, or pending if maybe there's some items on their to-do list they need to still complete, or if there's any issues with them with that financial aid, they'll be flagged in the red as their steps that they need to take to fix and make sure they get that financial aid. One of the things we want them to do, as well as I mentioned a little bit with the Chafee grant, is confirm that their school of attendance is accurate. They're filling out their FAFSA, they're entering a lot of different schools they might be considering. This is when, once they are clear on where they're going to attend in the fall, to log into their WebGrants account and make sure that that college is correctly indicated on their account. And this will be the college they're planning on attending. Another step, and this is a really critical step, is to make sure that their high school GPA has been received by CSAC. And this is to determine eligibility for the Cal Grant. For the Cal Grant, students have to have at least a 2.0 GPA. It can vary though, depending if they're doing a career and technical education program. But a lot of times, particularly for our students, the high school may submit the GPA, but maybe now they're at a different high school when they fill out their FAFSA with a different address, and maybe there's a mismatch in the data system, or maybe that high school didn't submit that GPA, or they entered their name differently than the student entered their name on their FAFSA. Sometimes there can be issues with that with the data, and so it's really important that the student goes in to make sure their high school GPA is in there and matched so they can get their eligibility for things like the Cal Grant. And if not, there's instructions on there and they should contact their high school counselor or the Student Aid Commission to get assistance to manually ensure that that GPA is submitted. Next, we'll want to make sure that they enter their high school graduation date. This is a function that becomes available on the website on the first day of the month of their planned graduation month. So they can enter that once they know that. And then lastly, this is just for our students who are eligible for the Chafee grant. If they applied for the Chafee grant, we want to make sure that they check to see what's called their Department of Social Services record is verified. This is their record to verify their foster care status to be eligible for the Chafee grant. So the good news is foster youth status for the purposes of the Chafee grant is done through an auto data match between CDSS and CSAC. So generally speaking, the student doesn't have to do anything to provide verification of their foster youth status. But we do want to make sure that that was correctly matched, because similarly, sometimes there can be errors with the data match process, just like with GPA of difference in spelling, and it can trigger eligibility not just for the Chiefy grant, but for other really important financial aid like the Cal Grant B Access Award, the expanded middle class scholarship for foster youth. So we want to make sure that that match is working, and if not, that the student follows the instructions to fill out the manual verification form. And this is where you as an adult supporter can assist the student in making sure that that verification is provided so they can access that financial aid. Here's a screenshot of what it might look like within the WebGrants account. You can see there's a section there to make sure their FAFSA is complete, their Chiefy application's complete, and then it shows if their Department of Social Services record is complete or incomplete. One thing to keep in mind, though, they only do the data match for foster youth with CDSS once a month, so it doesn't happen instantly. So if the student filled out their Chiefy grant, they log in and it says incomplete, not to panic, maybe have them check back again in another few weeks, since they only do that match monthly. And if it's still not there, I would say the next month, then I would have them complete the steps and fill out that eligibility certification form. So another key step that we recommend is to educate your students about satisfactory academic progress. Once the student fills out the application, they receive their financial aid. Receiving it is really just the first step. Once the students have their financial aid, they must meet what's called satisfactory academic progress, or SAP standards, to be able to continue to maintain their eligibility for financial aid. So it comes down to really three key components. One is the student, once they get their financial aid and they're in college, they have to maintain a good GPA along the way of at least a 2.0 GPA. And they have to pass enough of their classes along the way. So typically that means successfully completing about 67% of all the credits that they attempt. So what that means is if they get an F, or they withdraw from a class, that can count against that passing rate. And lastly, they have to complete their degree within a reasonable amount of time. So what they define that as is they have to complete their degree or certificate program within a maximum time frame that's 150% of the published length of the educational program. So what that means is, let's say someone is enrolled in an associate's degree program. It says it takes 60 units to complete that AA. Well, then they'll say, okay, well, you're allowed to take up to 90 units to complete their degree. So they want to make sure that they're enrolled in the right courses along the way towards their degree goal. And why this all matters is that if they fail to meet their institution's SAP standards for 2 consecutive terms, they'll lose their eligibility for most financial aid. So we want to make sure that students know about this so they can keep that financial aid once they're in college. So here are some key tips for students to educate them about the SAP process. We hear it over and over. Students just will say, I just didn't know about SAP standards. I didn't understand how it worked. And then they end up losing their financial aid. So educate them as part of your work as you're helping them fill out their FAFSA and their CADAA. Another recommendation that we have is make sure that they are meeting with their academic counselor so that they're registering for the right classes towards their educational goal, so that they're not wasting their time and running out of time that they have towards that maximum time frame. We also recommend advise your students if they're thinking of withdrawing from a class, right? That can impact their completion rate, and we want them to talk to a counselor before they drop or withdraw from any classes, so they're really making the best decision for them and understand potential impacts to their financial aid. Now, sometimes life happens. A student might go through an unfortunate circumstance, sometimes called a special circumstance in the world of financial aid. They have a death of a family member, they're experiencing homelessness, they have a severe illness, pregnancy, childbirth. Things can happen where it ends up impacting a student's ability to do well in their classes. And so if that does happen, students should be encouraged to file a SAP appeal. and to contact their financial aid office to get information about that appeal process, to be able to get their financial aid reinstated. And lastly, we recommend to connect your students to resources as early on as possible to be proactive, not reactive. Have them start to think in advance as they're planning for that semester. Maybe they, don't do well in math and they're going to be taking a math class. Let's get them connected to tutoring at the beginning of the semester until waiting till the end. Or if they need additional supports with housing, mental health, making sure they're set up for success. So once they're starting their semester, they have the resources they need to do well in their courses. One last thing I did want to mention is that good news, due to the recent passage of AB 789 here in California, some of the SAP laws have recently changed that really reduce some of the additional barriers that were sometimes imposed on students around SAP standards and to really improve access for students to the SAP appeal process. Now, for the purposes of today's webinar, we're not going to, dive deep into SAP and all of the policies, but for our folks on the webinar today that are working at a college or, you're a financial aid administrator, I did want to share that we did put together a toolkit to help institutions implement these changes here in California. And there's great resources and best practices that you can utilize at your campus. And so we'll put that link into the chat, and feel free to check that resource out, and you can always reach out to us here at JB2. We're offering technical assistance if you have any questions along the way. So I wanted to take a moment to tell you about CalKids. We don't have time today to talk about all the different financial aid opportunities out there, but did want to share with you about CalKids, which is California's very new college savings account program. So there are two types of CalKids college savings accounts. One is for babies born here in California. Depending on when they were born and when the program first started a few years ago, they were able to get at least $25 into their college savings account. Now they can get at least $100 into that account, even some more, depending on different steps they take along the way. But the really important one we wanted to flag for you for the students that you're serving is there's also a school age account component of the program. So for eligible low-income students here in California, they can get $500 in this account. And if they are also identified as a foster youth or homeless youth, they can get an additional $500. So we know for our youth in foster care, we're also categorically low income. Similarly with homeless students, that might mean that they might have about $1,000 in this college savings account. And these accounts have really been shown that particularly as, the sooner you can start telling students about these accounts, it helps to plant the seed for them about their college potential and that college can be part of their future. So in terms of eligibility, bear with me here, I'm going to walk you through this chart. So when the program first rolled out for our low-income students, it rolled out in 21-22. And for any students who are low-income, foster youth, or homeless youth in 1st through 12th grade, we're eligible to get those accounts. And that's for students that were identified by their school district as low-income foster or homeless youth on census day of that year, so October 6th, 2021 to be exact. So if you're working with any seniors right now and you think, you know what, they may have been identified as low income, foster or homeless, in 21-22, they might have at least $500 sitting in that account. So we're really encouraging folks as part of your FAFSA efforts this year, have that student fill out the FAFSA and then have them go onto the CalKids website to check and see if they've got money there and claim that money, because we're seeing that it's like 6% of students have claimed their accounts. So a lot of students just don't know about this new college savings account program. Now, after 21-22, it was only for low-income foster or homeless students in the 1st grade that were eligible to get that funding. Similarly, in 23-24 and 24-25. But I do want to share, just to plant the seed for you all, something coming down the road for next year, due to a recent bill that passed, starting next year in 2025, for our foster youth students only, they will be able to access the account if they're in 1st through 12th grade rather than just the 1st grade. But, for all other students, it will continue to remain that they'll be eligible for these accounts if they're low income and homeless in the first grade. So again, encourage your students to go to the website and claim these accounts. You can claim them at any time. So, the sooner the better. And the funds can be used once the student is enrolled in an eligible college. That it can include, technical schools, vocational schools. So right now we just want them to go in and register. And then when they're ready, they can use those funds at any point before the age of 26. And to get more information, you can go to calkids.org, and all the instructions are there as well. So we wanted to leave you with a few resources. We have a lot of resources to support you in working with your students and completing financial aid applications. We have a great financial aid guide for California foster and unaccompanied homeless youth. This gives you an overview of all the different types of financial aid, key steps in applying, covers SAP, as we talked about, how to maintain financial aid. And I wanted to flag this as well. In the back, we have a list of private scholarships, and there are a lot of private scholarships out there for youth in the foster care system. We also have a listing of general private scholarship resources that are out there. So definitely, we didn't talk too much about this today, but encourage your students to also apply for private scholarships. And this guide will be on our website today. We'll have it ready in Spanish within the next week. And then we also have these step-by-step visual guides. So this is where we do have screenshots of every single question on the applications that you can use to walk through and helping your students fill out their applications. The FAFSA one is ready. We're still, the CADAA was just released, so we don't yet have those slides, but we'll have those out as well soon. And we also have these great toolkits that are specifically designed for high school counselors. So these are toolkits to help your general high school counselor who may not know about these student populations and supporting. We have one just for those in supporting foster youth, and we have another one in how they can support students experiencing homelessness. So we'll have that up within the week as well. And then today's recording and all of our materials from today will also be posted on our website on that link. We'll get that up there soon by the end of the week, and you can always access that at any time. Another resource for those of you who serve foster youth is we do have these step-by-step post-secondary education planning guides. These are, above and beyond just financial aid. This is everything you might need to know on how to support a youth in foster care in middle school and high school in preparing for post-secondary education and all those key educational planning milestones along the way. We have an adult supporter version. We have a high school youth-facing version. We've got it in English and Spanish. There's student spotlight videos in there too, embedded throughout. So definitely encourage you to check that resource out. You can download it for free, or you can also order hard copies if you'd like to pay and order those. And then we also have a lot of great information for our foster youth students on our other website, californiacollegepathways.org. And also has a great search function if you're looking to get your students in foster care connected to campus-based foster youth support programs here in California. Lastly, wanted to leave you with some additional resources. As we mentioned, our partners at Schoolhouse Connection have a wealth of great resources for those of you serving students experiencing homelessness, including those sample determination letters, a referral form for the McKinney-Vento liaisons, and screening tools, resources, you name it. Great resource, definitely check that out. Also resources for homeless students at the National Center for Homeless Education. I Can Go to College provides just general college resources, not specific to foster youth or homeless youth. And our partners at Youth Law Center have a guide specifically for justice-involved youth. And lastly, Immigrants Rising is another great resource for those of you serving undocumented students. And if this webinar wasn't enough and you want to practice and get more familiar with the FAFSA also has a prototype website that you can go into and log in and play around and familiarize yourself with the FAFSA if you'd like to practice before working with a student. So we did it. We made it to the end. I've been looking at the Q&A. There have been lots of questions. It looks like we've answered them all, but we do have just a few minutes left. Debbie, I wanted to ask you if there were any questions that came up that we wanted to share with the group.
Yeah, I will highlight a couple. We've had a few people asking about ordering financial aid guides, and I have communicated that we will provide some information in the follow-up email for those people who are interested in ordering hard copies. In terms of other questions, there was a lot of questions about juvenile justice students. So maybe if you could clarify quickly kind of the distinction, which students who were involved in the juvenile justice system qualify for independent status and which would not qualify for independent status?
Sure. So when we're talking about youth in the juvenile justice system that would qualify for independent status, we're not talking about, any youth who is involved in juvenile justice or on probation. We're specifically talking about those youth who are, our duly enrolled foster youth who are being, who were either in the foster care system and then placed in the juvenile justice system, or, entered juvenile justice and then were placed in foster care. So these are youth who were, not returned back to their families and essentially in out-of-home care, foster care, but under the jurisdiction of our probation department. So a very narrow population that we're talking about, not those that are incarcerated or in the juvenile halls more broadly.
Thanks. And just to clarify, the term ward of the court in California sometimes is used to refer to a youth in the juvenile justice system, but that's not how that term is being used on the FAFSA, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. There was several questions about youth who are adopted. So can you just clarify, if a youth is adopted, what distinguishes them? Like what age would they have to be adopted out of foster care at? How does that impact their independent status?
Yeah, great question. So the critical age there is 13. So when we're looking at independent status on the FAFSA, it's asking if they were in out-of-home foster care placement, as that dependent or ward of the court at least one day on or after their 13th birthday. So if they were adopted before the age of 13, they do not qualify for independent status on the FAFSA. If they were adopted at some point after the age of 13, they would qualify again, as long as they were that dependent or ward of the court for at least one day after their 13th birthday.
Thank you. And for verification of foster care status, do they actually have to have a document, an official document from the court? Or are there now a number of different options for how foster care status can be verified?
Yeah, so with the new FAFSA, they expanded the list of potential ways that a student could get verification of foster care status. So it used to be a little more narrow, but now it's broader. And we do have a slide on the PowerPoint so that lists them all out. I don't know if I have them all memorized, but for example, like if they have a CASA, that CASA can do the letter. If they're in a foster care placement, that agency can do the letter as well. It doesn't have to be just from the court. So there's a variety of ways now for them to get that documentation.
Thanks. And then there have been some questions about whether or not you're going to be compiling the Q&A and sending it out to folks.
I'm looking at you, Megan, virtually. I believe we are doing
Yeah,
that.
that's the plan to compile the Q&A. There's a lot of great questions in here, so we want to make sure they're captured. But so yes, we will do that when we send out the recording and the slides as well.
Great. I think those were sort of the gist of the most of the questions that came in. There was a lot of very detailed questions, so if we didn't get to yours, we will look through them all and send that out through the email that goes out afterwards.
Great. Well, thank you, Debbie, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us today and supporting your students and filling out their financial aid applications. If you have other questions that come up, feel free to reach out to Megan and I. And again, we'll be sending out all the materials from the webinar today and the Q&A, and we're available if you need any additional support. So thank you so much.